My name is Danica. I am 31 years old. And that morning, I stood in my driveway feeling my chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognition. The spot where my Tesla Model X should have been was completely empty. No broken glass, no tire marks, no sign of a tow, just clean pavement where my car had been parked the night before. I grabbed my phone with shaking hands and called Mom and Dad because even in that moment, I still believed there had to be a reasonable explanation that did not involve betrayal. My voice came out fast and unsteady as I said my car was gone and I needed to know what was happening. My mother did not hesitate. She said, "Oh honey, relax. Your brother borrowed it just 1 week." The word borrowed did not sit right in my head. My car was not something that could be borrowed without my permission. I asked where it was. I asked why nobody told me. I asked how this could happen without a single message to me. The answers were soft, almost rehearsed. That was when I realized the car did not just disappear. Someone had decided for me. My hand slowly lowered the phone. I did not argue. I did not explain. I did not ask again. I ended the call, opened my keypad, and typed in 3 numbers with a calm that scared me. I called 911. If you have ever felt your trust crack in a single moment, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel and share your thoughts in the comments because this story is only beginning. Growing up, I learned very early who was allowed to fail and who was expected to fix everything. In my family, comfort was never evenly distributed. Some mistakes were treated like accidents, while others were treated like responsibilities. That pattern shaped the way I saw myself long before I had words for it. I learned to stay quiet, to adjust, to move around problems instead of expecting them to be solved. I understood that peace in the house depended on how little trouble I caused, not on how fairly things were handled. My brother Kyle was always protected in a way I never questioned out loud, but always noticed internally. When he made poor choices, Mom explained them away as stress, as pressure, as bad timing. When he lost jobs, there was always a reason that made it sound less serious, less permanent, less his fault. Dad rarely spoke during these moments, choosing silence over conflict, which quietly left me in the position of absorbing whatever tension remained in the room. Over time, I learned that silence from authority figures was not neutrality. It was a decision that shaped everyone else's role. Kyle spent money without planning, without structure, without thinking about what came next. Bills went unpaid. Phones got cut off. Credit cards reached limits that were never discussed directly. Every time something fell apart, the house shifted slightly to make space for him, while I adapted without being asked. There were moments when I wanted to ask why things were always softened for him. But I knew from experience that those conversations did not go anywhere useful. Instead of confronting it, I started storing those feelings inside myself, stacking them quietly year after year. I took the opposite path because I felt like I had no other option. I worked wherever I could. Retail counters, late shifts, side jobs that paid just enough to feel like progress. I learned how to manage money because nobody else was going to do it for me. And because I needed something in my life that felt solid, dependable, and mine. I did not borrow. I did not ask. I built everything quietly without expecting recognition. That discipline did not come from motivation. It came from fear of becoming dependent on people who had never protected me emotionally. Over time, my independence stopped feeling like loneliness and started feeling like control. I paid my own expenses. I handled my own problems. I stopped hoping that fairness would show up in my family. And I stopped waiting for approval before making decisions. That mindset stayed with me through every hour I worked and every responsibility I carried. It shaped how I spoke, how I planned, how I trusted, and how I valued my own effort. When I finally bought my Tesla Model X, it was not just a car to me. It was evidence that my effort had built something real. I paid for it myself from beginning to end. No help, no shortcuts, no invisible safety net waiting underneath me. Every payment felt like proof that I had made it out of the pattern I grew up inside. The car became a quiet symbol of distance between who I was expected to be and who I had forced myself to become. I did not brag about it. I did not celebrate loudly. I just sat behind the wheel sometimes and let myself feel proud in silence because that feeling had been earned in ways nobody around me fully understood, and because for the first time something in my life belonged only to me without compromise. About a week after I brought the Tesla home, something felt off. That morning started like any other, which made the moment feel even stranger when I stepped outside and saw the space where my car usually sat completely empty. There was no sound of an alarm in my memory. No broken glass on the ground. No marks on the driveway that suggested a struggle or forced entry. The disappearance felt clean, almost deliberate, like the car had been taken with permission that I never gave. I stood there for a few seconds trying to make sense of it without letting panic take over. I walked around the side of the house and looked down the street, hoping I had simply parked somewhere unusual the night before and forgotten about it. I checked behind the house and then came back inside to grab my phone, knowing deep down that I was only delaying the moment of truth. The car was gone and nothing around me could explain how. I called Mom and Dad because part of me still wanted to believe there was a harmless explanation waiting on the other end of the line. I kept my voice steady when I asked if they knew anything about where my car might be. After a short pause, Mom answered in the exact tone she always used when she wanted to smooth something over quickly. "Oh, honey, relax. Your brother borrowed it. Just 1 week." The way she said it made it sound casual, almost routine, as if lending out something that belonged to me was a small favor rather than a line that had been crossed. I asked where the car was. I asked when it would be returned. The answers felt vague, carefully shaped, and wrapped in words that sounded more like protection than honesty. I ended the call without arguing because in that moment, I wasn't interested in winning a conversation. I was interested in observing the gaps between what I was being told and what was actually happening. A few hours later, my phone lit up with a message that shifted everything inside me. The text came from a neighbor named Travis, someone who passed through the commercial area during his lunch break, and recognized my car instantly. He wrote that he had seen my Tesla being driven by Kyle parked near a row of title loan and pawn offices sitting at the curb like the driver was deciding whether to go inside. That single detail pressed against my chest in a slow and uncomfortable way because it did not match the harmless story I had been offered earlier. I did not reply right away. I read the message again, then again, letting each word settle instead of rushing into anger. A borrowed car does not drift around businesses built on turning property into fast cash, and a simple favor does not involve hesitation outside a building designed for people running out of options. I felt the first quiet shift in my thinking, moving away from the word borrowed and toward thoughts I had avoided naming. I tried calling Kyle. The first call rang until it dropped. The second went straight to voicemail. I sent a message asking where he was. I sent another asking if my car was safe. I chose my words carefully because I wanted truth more than excuses. Minutes turned into longer stretches of silence, and the lack of response stopped feeling accidental. It began to feel deliberate, controlled, and purposeful, like someone who knew exactly what avoiding a call meant. I kept checking my phone, not out of panic, but out of a growing need to confirm that the pattern I was seeing was real. There were no missed calls, no short replies, no sudden explanations, only a steady blankness that carried more weight with every passing hour. I started noticing how carefully conversations had been framed earlier, how quickly certain questions had been redirected, and how much effort had gone into making everything sound normal when nothing about it actually was. By the end of that day, I no longer believed I had been told the full story. I did not argue with anyone, and I did not accuse anyone, but I could feel the truth forming quietly in the background as I observed the small details everyone hoped I would ignore. What felt like a simple situation on the surface began to feel organized underneath, carried by familiar voices that had learned how to hide uncomfortable facts without ever raising their volume. That evening didn't feel like a visit. It felt like walking into a decision. I drove straight to my parents' house because talking on the phone no longer felt real enough to carry the weight of what had happened. I parked outside and walked in without calling first because at that point I did not care about being polite or patient. I only cared about hearing the truth face to face. Mom was in the kitchen and Dad was in the living room, and both of them looked at me the same way they always did when something was about to get uncomfortable. I told them I was not there to argue or raise my voice. I was there because my car was gone and I already knew Kyle had it. Mom did not hesitate and did not soften her tone. She looked at me and said, "Don't make this a big deal." She said it the way people talk when they want a problem to disappear without actually solving it, the same way she had used every time a situation involved Kyle and consequences. Dad stepped in before I could respond, and his voice stayed low, almost defensive when he said, "We're just trying to help him." I looked at both of them and asked who exactly they were protecting, because no one had asked me for permission, and no one had bothered to tell me the truth until I demanded it. Mom folded her arms and added, "It's just for a week. He'll bring it back." I told them that a car is not something you lend without asking, especially not one that someone worked years to pay for. Mom responded that family faced hard times together and that Kyle was going through a rough period, which sounded like the same excuse I had heard for most of my life. Dad avoided my eyes while telling me that they did not think I would mind helping out because I had always been the one who handled things better. I asked them directly how they took the keys and how Kyle got access to the car without me knowing, and Mom admitted that she had given them to him earlier that day. She said it calmly, as if she were talking about handing someone a jacket or a grocery list, not something that belonged solely to me. That was the moment I understood they did not see it as a boundary. They saw it as something they were allowed to cross without consequences. I told them that what they did was not borrowing. It was taking something that did not belong to them, and they reacted as if I were being dramatic instead of direct. Dad raised his voice slightly and said, "They were not trying to hurt me, but could not explain why hurting me had become acceptable as long as Kyle felt supported." Mom kept repeating that it would only be a week and that I should not act like a stranger in my own family. I did not tell them that I had already started to move differently from that moment forward, because I wanted to see how far they were willing to go to protect a version of the story that kept them comfortable. I asked if Kyle had called or texted, and Mom said he had not, then brushed it off by saying he probably just needed time to cool down. That told me everything I needed to know about where I stood. I walked out of that house without shouting, without crying, without promising anything. I simply told them that I would not forget how easily they chose to make a decision about my life without asking me. Mom told me I was being stubborn. Dad told me not to turn the situation into something ugly, and neither of them tried to stop me from leaving. When I got back into my car, I sat there long enough to understand that what happened was not an accident or a misunderstanding. It was a choice they made without thinking about what it would cost me. I drove away without saying goodbye because at that moment there was nothing left to say. The next morning felt colder even inside my own home. I drove straight to the police station without stopping for coffee or checking my phone because I needed the report to be clean, official, and impossible to twist later by anyone who might try to soften what had been done. I sat across from an officer who listened without interrupting while I gave my full name and explained that my Tesla Model X had been taken without my consent from a private parking space that showed no forced entry, no broken locks, and no visible signs of vandalism. I handed over every document I had, including registration papers, proof of payment, insurance confirmation, and the title that still carried my name alone, then waited as he examined each page in silence. They treated it like a standard procedure. Yet, it felt heavier to me because I already knew who had been behind it, even though I never said his name out loud at that desk. I answered their questions clearly and avoided emotional language because I understood that tone mattered, and I wanted everything written in that report to sound controlled, accurate, and strong enough to stand if it was ever read in a courtroom. The officer asked whether anyone in my family had access to the vehicle, and I paused just long enough to answer truthfully without adding unnecessary details. After the paperwork was filed, I worked directly with the police team while they began requesting footage from nearby street cameras and security systems mounted on surrounding buildings. I sat in a small room that smelled like old coffee while videos played on a shared screen, watching familiar angles of roads where I had driven dozens of times now, feeling strange as if I were observing a stranger's routine instead of my own. They tracked timestamps carefully and explained how the system could follow movement patterns without relying on eyewitness testimony. While this was happening, my phone started vibrating more than I expected. Mom called repeatedly, leaving messages that shifted in tone from soft concern to quiet panic. Then moved to clear instructions that I should stop talking to police immediately because I was making something harmless look dangerous. I listened to every voicemail without responding because responding would have pulled me into a conversation that would not change my decision or the direction things had already taken. Her words tried to make me feel reckless, even though all I had done was report a vehicle that was legally mine. Dad did not leave long messages. He sent short texts that avoided the subject completely, usually asking about unrelated things like whether I was eating properly or if work was too stressful, as if pretending nothing serious was happening, could erase it. When I tried to call him directly, he did not answer and later sent a message saying he was busy, which felt like another quiet step backward rather than a refusal to speak. As more footage came in, officers showed me how the car moved through certain intersections in a pattern that suggested it had been driven with intention, not borrowed casually for a short errand. I focused on their screens and gave short confirmations whenever they asked if I recognized locations because I did not want to appear unsure or hesitant in front of people whose job depended on clarity. I signed additional forms that allowed them to request data from nearby toll systems and parking structures, knowing those layers would deepen the paper trail. The hardest part was not the paperwork or the waiting rooms, but the understanding that every step I took was now impossible to reverse and that it would eventually land on the people who raised me, whether they admitted their role or not. I felt guilt pressing against my decisions like a steady weight that never disappeared. Even when I reminded myself that I did not create the situation and had not forced anyone to act without honesty. By late afternoon, Mom called again, this time asking me directly to stop cooperating because she said it would destroy him even though she avoided saying his name. I told her only that I had already filed the report and could not undo it, then ended the call before it could turn into a longer argument. The silence that followed did not feel peaceful, but it felt necessary, as if my role had shifted from daughter to witness, from participant to someone who had chosen to let truth stand on its own. 2 days later, reality hit harder than fear. The call came in the early afternoon, not dramatic, not rushed, just steady enough to make my hands stop shaking. A police officer told me the Tesla had been located through a trail connected to a financial holding report linked to a title loan office. They did not sound surprised. They sounded experienced. I realized in that moment that this kind of story was not rare to them, which made everything feel colder, more procedural, less personal than I had imagined. I drove to the location with a strange kind of quiet inside me. It was not the panic I expected. It was not the anger either. It was something colder and heavier, like my mind had already accepted that I was about to see something I could never unsee. Something that would quietly follow me long after I left that place. The car was there. It was mine. At the same time, it did not feel like it belonged to me anymore. The inside looked torn apart in a way that felt deliberate rather than rushed. The leather sections had been removed. The center console was gone. Several electronic modules were missing. The charging components that mattered most to the system had been stripped, as if someone understood what would bring fast cash. The officer explained the list calmly, using professional language that felt distant from my reality. While I tried to match his words to what I was seeing in front of me, piece by piece, part by part, Kyle was not there. There was no sign of him. There were no recent tracks, no personal items, no clear indication of when he had last been at that location. His phone remained unreachable, no replies, no callbacks, no trace beyond what the investigators were able to collect. The absence felt louder than any argument we had ever had, heavier than any memory connected to him. What hit me hardest was not the damage. It was the feeling that someone had crossed a boundary that could not be explained away. The car had not been taken for a short ride. It had not been borrowed. It had been used as a tool. It had been turned into an object meant to be broken for value. That conclusion settled in slowly without needing anyone to say it out loud, without needing proof beyond what was in front of me. The officer asked me to sign paperwork confirming the condition. My hand moved like it belonged to someone else while I filled in each line. I noticed how formal everything felt, how structured the process was, how clear the system treated this as a financial crime instead of a family situation. That realization sat in my chest longer than I expected, heavier than the sound of traffic in the distance. I stood by the car longer than necessary, even though there was nothing left to look at. I was not staring at plastic or metal. I was staring at a choice that had been made without me. A chain of decisions that had nothing to do with needing a ride and everything to do with needing money. At that point, the word borrowed stopped making sense in every language I knew. When I finally walked away, the officer told me they would continue searching. He said they were updating the file. He said the next step would come soon. That sentence stayed with me as the only thing that felt certain. 2 weeks later, everything came back around. I was at home when the call finally came through, and it did not come from family or anyone who cared about what this process felt like to me. A police officer told me that Kyle had been located after a traffic stop tied to another open report connected to financial misconduct. The tone of his voice was calm and neutral, as though this was another routine update added to a growing list of cases he handled every week. The officer explained that Kyle had been taken into custody and that his name was now formally connected to charges involving unlawful use of property, destruction of registered assets, and financial misrepresentation linked directly to the title loan office. The language was structured, legal, and precise, which made it feel like they were talking about someone I had never met rather than someone I shared a childhood with. A few hours later, Mom called. Her voice sounded unsteady and thin, and she moved past any greeting as if emotions were optional. In that moment, she said, "Please, you have to withdraw the report. He'll be ruined forever." I let her finish every word without interruption, and I let the call stay open long enough for her to believe she had been heard, even though I did not give her the comfort of agreement. That same evening, Dad reached out. He sounded controlled, careful, less emotional, and more deliberate, choosing words as if they were tools designed to apply pressure rather than offer understanding. He said, "You've done enough. There's no need to destroy him over this." And the meaning behind his words was clear, even without further explanation. I understood exactly what that tone meant, and I understood that this was not advice, but a quiet demand that I undo what had already been set in motion. He never asked what it felt like to stand beside the car in that condition. And he never asked what it felt like to see months of effort turned into stripped metal and empty wiring. Instead, he framed the situation as if stopping the consequences was now my responsibility. Rather than acknowledging that this situation existed because of choices I did not make or approve, I stayed silent, and that silence held more weight than any argument would have carried. In the days that followed, the process moved forward in a slow, methodical way that made everything feel more permanent. Investigators called with updates. Statements were reviewed. Evidence was logged. Reports were confirmed. The case stopped feeling like a family conflict and started feeling like a legal matter moving through a system designed to handle damage without emotion. Kyle did not reach out to me, and no apologies passed through anyone else, and no messages appeared where silence had already settled. Mom called again later, and her voice no longer sounded broken but frustrated, tired, and edged with anger. She said, "Do you really want this to go this far?" And the question hung in the air longer than she probably expected. I did not answer the question directly because my silence was the answer. By refusing to interfere, I allowed the process to continue without softening it, without rewriting it, and without pretending the damage had been smaller than it was. Some decisions cannot be softened, and some boundaries cannot be rewritten once they have been crossed. That night, something inside me finally settled into place in a way that felt quiet, solid, and final. And in that moment, I understood that this was not the end of the story. Months later, I stopped waiting for things to go back to normal. By the time Kyle faced real consequences, I had already learned to live without checking my phone or wondering what story would arrive next. The legal system moved slower than emotion, but it moved with clarity, and the outcome followed a process that no one in my family could soften, redirect, or escape. He faced formal charges connected to unlawful use of property, financial manipulation, and intentional damage. And every step was handled through courts, attorneys, and procedures that did not care about our last name or our shared history. Mom tried several times to insert herself where she no longer had any legal reach. Her calls stopped being requests and started sounding like demands that I return to my old role as the one who held everything together in silence. The system did not respond to those efforts, and neither did I. Dad attempted a different approach, using pressure that came wrapped in concern, suggesting that family reputation mattered more than personal safety or truth. But even that voice began to lose power once I realized it was built on control rather than care. I moved without announcing it. I chose a quiet neighborhood far from places that held too many memories. I changed my phone number, removed old contacts, closed doors I once believed were permanent, and built a daily routine that no longer included waiting for explanations. There was no confrontation goodbye. There was no last speech. There was no ceremony. I simply stopped answering, stopped responding, stopped allowing emotional noise to interrupt the life I was building. People sometimes imagine that the ending of a story like this includes forgiveness, shared tears, or a sudden reunion that repairs what was broken. But none of that happened, and none of it was needed. There was no reunion. There was no peace offering. There was no dinner table conversation where everything became clear. There was only distance, and for the first time that distance felt clean. The truth is that losing trust inside a family changes something permanently because blood does not cancel damage and love does not excuse destruction. When someone crosses a line that involves safety, identity, or survival, the answer is not always reconciliation. And that truth took me years to accept. I learned that silence can be a form of strength, that walking away can be a form of courage, and that choosing yourself does not make you cruel. It makes you honest. The most difficult lesson was also the most important one because I stopped measuring my worth by how much pain I was willing to endure for people who never protected me. I stopped believing that forgiveness was a requirement. I stopped thinking that strength meant staying. I learned that boundaries are not walls meant to punish others, but doors meant to protect your future. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is decide that access to your life must be earned, not inherited. If you stayed with me until this moment, thank you for listening to my story from beginning to end. I want to know what you would have done in my place because real-life decisions are never as simple as people think when they are watching from the outside. Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me where you are listening from and let me know if you believe family should always be forgiven or if there are moments where walking away is the only form of self-respect.